Hi, this is Emily Leiphart of Art from the Heart, and in this video I'll be sharing a couple of cards using the Nuts About You stamp set, which is a limited edition Neat and Tangled and Simon Says Stamp STAMPtember collaboration. This might be my favorite stamp set ever, with 2 squirrels, 2 acorns, 2 coffees, a pumpkin, several accessories, and wonderful sentiments. It's the perfect stamp set for fall, especially if you love cute squirrels and coffee. To prepare for my cards, I've stamped out 2 mock layouts where the stamps are used in different ways. I'm starting with a panel that's a 1/4 inch smaller than a standard A2 card base. I'm arranging the stamps on the panel to center everything. For my first card, I want the squirrel to be standing on the pumpkin in the middle, but I want 2 pumpkins behind that in the background. I'll stamp the background pumpkins directly onto the panel and pop up the squirrel with the pumpkin in the middle. I'm going to stamp the sentiment and the background pumpkins first. For the squirrel standing on the pumpkin, I'm going to do partial die cutting on both the squirrel and the pumpkin to join the 2 images into one. First, I need to create a mask for the squirrel to make it look as if the 2 images are actually one. I only need to be precise on the bottom of the squirrel right now because that's the edge I need to mask off when I stamp the pumpkin. I'll trim out the rest of the squirrel later and keep the mask for future use. I place the squirrel mask over the original image and stamp the pumpkin. Then I remove the mask, and now it looks like the squirrel is standing on the pumpkin. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to store the squirrel mask in the same storage pocket so I have it for future use. I'm going to use both the dies for the squirrel and pumpkin, but I'm only going to use the top half of the squirrel die and the bottom half of the pumpkin die. For those of you who've never tried this technique before, you may have to do it a couple of times to get the hang of it. Basically, it works the same way as when you partial die cut an image against a straight line edge or any kind of frame, but it will be more difficult to get a perfect cut. Sometimes it just so happens that you get it perfect the first time, but it really depends on the complexity of the die and whether there are a lot of details on the edge. The fact that there's a bumpy leaf on one side of the squirrel makes it harder to combine the 2 dies. I place the top plate over the section of the pumpkin that I want cut, trying not to get it up too high, otherwise it'll cut into the squirrel, which it does. I'm not too worried about how it looks because most of it will be hidden when the images have been colored. If I wanted to, I could try again, but I want you to see what happens in a real-life attempt. First, I cut the bottom half of the pumpkin, and then I put it through again to cut the leaf on the side. After I remove the die, you can see the areas that were cut out around the edges of the pumpkin image. Now I'll partially die cut around the top part of the squirrel to finish cutting around the image. After running it through for the top of the squirrel, I turn it 90 degrees and run it through again to cut the tail, around to where it meets the pumpkin. All of the images for the first card are now complete, so I start coloring. I use 4 shades of orange Copic markers for the pumpkins. I'm fast forwarding through the first one, and I won't show the other 2 since they use the same colors. You'll notice that I didn't completely color all of the pumpkins in the background. The parts I've left uncolored will be hidden behind the squirrel standing on the pumpkin. Now I'm using 3 shades of brown for the stems. Next, I use 3 shades of green to color in the leaves. All of the colors I used in this video will be listed in the description below, and if a visual is easier for you, then please head over to my blog using the link below. Then I'll use warm grays to color in the squirrel's belly as well as other areas like the insides of the ears, around the outer edges of the head and the paws. I start with the lighter shades and then use darker shades to create depth on the other areas. I also add in pink cheeks because that's always fun and makes any character look cuter. For the cheeks, I add the pink before filling in the face with light gray, but then I add more afterwards so it really looks like the blush is coming from within. I love that I can blend 2 completely different colors of Copic markers. I decide to color the scarf green to match the leaves and to keep the number of colors to a minimum. Now I'm going to stamp the little take-up cup, color and die cut it. I use reds for the heart, light browns for the cardboard sleeve, and gray for the cup and lid. Next, I'm going to create a border on my card base using black gesso. I use this technique a lot because I love the way the black gesso looks on the linen texture of the cardstock. Sometimes plain black cardstock is too boring, and I don't want to use stripes or polka dots, so this is something in between that looks just right. It doesn't compete against the images, but rather complements them. I also love that the gesso dries so quickly. It's ready by the time I clean up my craft sheet. I adhere the front panel flat to the card base and pop up the squirrel and coffee cup with foam tape. I decide to use the swirly stamp as steam rising from the coffee cup. I use a pencil to mark where the top of the cup would be before stamping. I tried a green ink at first and decide on a very light gray ink, but looking at the card now, I wish I had used a much darker gray or even the same black ink that I used for the images and the sentiment. I used masking paper to protect the card base next to the cup in case the bottom of the swirl was too long or accidentally left a smudge. I erased the pencil line and adhered the coffee cup with foam tape. Now my first card is done. For my second card, I used the largest image in the set with a nuts about you sentiment. This little acorn house with the squirrel peeking out from it is the cutest and so unique. I honestly couldn't stop squealing when I saw it. You can put the coffee cups as well as a smaller acorn in its little paws, but I'm going to use the heart since I'm going to add the squirrel from the other card and one squirrel is passing a love note to the other. I stamp the squirrel and the smaller acorn, then start on the coloring. For this card, I'm only going to show you the coloring for the images that weren't on the first card. That means I colored the squirrels off screen and I'm going to share how I colored the acorns. I use a trio of cool light browns for the bottom of the acorns and 4 warm dark browns for the top of the acorns. Typically when I color, and I've explained this in past videos, I color the entire area with the lightest of the 3 or 4 shades that I'm using and then add shadows along the edges and areas where light wouldn't normally reach. When I'm finished with the shading, I go back over the entire area to blend in all of the colors together. I color the scales of the top of the acorn the same way I would color shingles on a roof. Next, I die cut the second squirrel and acorn so I can arrange them in the foreground of my scene. I'm using the same type of card base that I made for the first card. I adhere the panel flat to the card base and pop up the extra elements with foam tape. I feel like the card is missing something on the right hand side, so I'm going to add one of the little leaves directly on the panel. I stamp and color that quickly, then reapply the small acorn. Now there's a visual triangle formed by the bits of green on the card, and my second card is done. I've given you 2 ideas on how to use this fabulous set, but there's so much more you can do with it. Run over to Simon Says Stamp and grab it while supplies last. This is a limited edition stamp and die set and will not be restocked once it sells out. Please refer to the supply links below if you're interested in any of the products I used in this video. You can also visit my blog for stills and more information about my cards. Thanks so much for watching!